My name is Malachi Black. I'm a poet, literature professor. I teach American poetry predominantly, English language, Anglophone, and creative writing at the University of San Diego in Southern California. But I have been moving back and forth from Lithuania and Vilnius in particular since 2018, though my first visit was prior to that. So I'm a Vilnius Pusemate resident. It was 2017 for the Druskininkai Poetic Fall Festival. I do have Lithuanian ancestry, Litvak ancestry. They left Lithuania in 1904 and 1905, respectively, my great-grandfather and his wife and their children, 3 of the 4 eventual children. My grandfather was born in the United States to these individuals, but I was the first member of my family to return to Lithuania in more than 100 years. But Lithuania was a mythological noun in our family imagination. I don't know that any of us, certainly not my father, nor I, had considered visiting until that moment. And I didn't know what to expect. Lithuania was like the North Pole, full of some series of Santa Clauses, I suppose. But I wasn't coming with the expectation of gifts. So the invitation to Druskininkai was quite exciting for me and even for my family in some respect. I was excited. I've spent my life as a poet. I became aware of myself as a poet at the age of 13. And I have always dreamt of a large community of individuals for whom literature was of such a consequence as to lead to deep investment and commitment. Not playfulness without purpose, though I have no resistance to play. I think the category of play and play theory is very relevant to the work of literature. But serious play is what I was interested in, and serious people for whom poetry was monumental in some way, of consequence socially as well as intellectually and perhaps even spiritually. I found a community like that in Druskininkai. Poetry is a trance condition. It's incantation. It's magical speech that changes the world in no way beyond our perception, but in changing our perception changes our engagement with the world, which itself maybe engenders some form of change. I think poetry is, as Paul Valéry said, a language inside of a language. And in this way, it's a sanctum. It's the Latin term that we would use for an inner room, a space in the deepest core of the language that activates something in the human capacity, not only for wonder, but for the experience of power, not political power, but the natural power of articulation and consciousness and music. I think the history of literature and the history of poetry in Lithuania as one so deeply connected to identity and nativity, to the very constitution of Lithuanianness, has continued to maintain inside of the literary community a deep sense of respect for what literature does. In the United States, of course, there are many people who share that orientation, but it's a massive country that is characterized by tremendous consumerism as a part of its faith. It's nearly the church is buying and selling. And this creates a very loose, flirtatious relationship with literature in many cases. You meet people who try it on as they would try on a coat or a dress, and their relationship to it is as significant as that. When they put poetry into the closet, they have forgotten about it. It is not their spirituality, it is not their intellectual orientation, it is not their belief system, it is not their, it's not inside of them in the way that speech is inside of us. So I can often feel and have often felt dismayed or even despondent over the condition of literature in America writ large, it seemed to me that at this festival in Druskininkai, what I encountered was people for whom poetry was a major and serious phenomenon in the real and actual world. And this was very refreshing to me. Listening to another language, the first thing one becomes aware of is the body of the speaker, and you realize that language is a string inside of us that makes us move almost like marionettes. And in this way, we are agents of our language. It determines us. So if you can't understand the language, the first thing you see is the human being in the presentation. And this was part of how I gathered my impression of the solemnity. It's really the word I want to use for it. The solemnity, the respect that Lithuanian poets have for poetry. But I can't say that I remember much about the content. My attention was only to the relationship between the agent and the act. My first encounter was with Tula Kunčinas. This was given to me by the woman who eventually became my wife, but it was Birute who offered this to me in the first few days of my encounter. This to me was a perfect introduction to Lithuanian literature, I think. It has honey inside of it, some sweetness of romance and yearning for Tula, but also this almost Bukowskian sense of decay and dilapidation and desperation and mental illness and alcoholism, and that circulating bat I remember vividly. But of course it's also set right there in Užupis. So you have this wonderful yoking of pieces of the Lithuanian past and the Lithuanian sensibility with something that I have begun to believe is at least a legacy of the pagan imagination inside of the Lietuviškai literary tradition, something of the magically real, where this bat's intervention seems to bestow some faith in the narrator of that text, that the world is full of its own forms of magic. And it's not exactly like the Latin American imagination that we describe as magical realism, but there's a cousin to that inside of these classic texts. And I read Venclava in translation. I read the entirety of a small anthology called The Daedalus Book of Lithuanian Literature, which collects short stories from the 19th century all the way to Gavelis. It was there I first read Gavelis's fantastic story, at least in English. It's called Handless, Berankis in Lietuviškai, that made quite an impression on me. I proceeded to read Gavelis in earnest, his actual works, Sansu in the Holy City of Vilnius Pokytis. I've read Sroga, Balys Sroga in The Forest of the Gods. Of course, I've read translations of the poets in How the Earth Carries Us. Rimas Užgiris's translations, Vilnius Review, was a major opportunity for engagement with the poets, and more. I don't remember all of them. I think Gavelis is, I think he's a major figure, and I regret that he's not better known in the United States, for example, where I think people would be intoxicated by his strange, postmodern, Kafkaesque sense of paranoia, urban paranoia, and desiccation, but also defiance. There's a tremendous strength in the character of his narrators, in my experience of them, in their persistence. The mere fact of their existence is their strength, and their continual perception, even in the desiccations and destruction and spiritual annihilation of the urban landscapes that seem to be his major preoccupation. So, Sroga, I think, is harder in English. I have a difficult time, for one thing, the narrator of that text is ironic in a way that I'm not sure works perfectly in the English translation, because it reduces your experience of the horror in a way that is not, I think in Lietuviškai that is a black humor that probably works, but in the English it seems too comfortable in its ironies and not horrified enough. You know, I think of somebody who's not from the Lithuanian tradition, but Borowski, you know, this who is also in the camps, a Polish writer. It's also full of black humor, but it's clearly participating in the inhumanity as well. So there's a level of self-accusation inside of Borovsky that allows the darkness to be judgmental of the narrator, as it is also, I think in Angliškai, it was translated by Stroga's granddaughter, this book. Of course, the events are horrible, and the opportunity to satirize it, to humorize it, is probably exactly right in the Lithuanian. But in the English, this fit, to me, is not perfectly correct. I needed more complexity than the repetition of exclamation points and irony, something that was deeper than just making fun of this horror. And I think that was lost somehow in the movement. It seems to me that one of the distinguishing characteristics of Lithuanian literature is that for many years it was resistant to imperial hegemony. And so no matter how dispersed the writers of the Lithuanian literary tradition were, they were writing back inside. A useful analogy on the almost inverted system would be Ireland, who took the language of empire and wrote out from Ireland into the English-speaking world. And what that creates is a unique character, of course, that we associate with the Irish, but it's really some hybrid of a domestic tradition with this new language, which sounds not Irish, because it is not from Ireland, it's not of the Irish people, but it's textured with their new impersonation of the imperial character. The Lithuanian tradition is obviously quite opposite, and by having the language spin into itself, almost like dough for a bread, it creates a thickness and a density that is distinctive in itself and became the mechanism, indeed the force field, the halo around the Lithuanian identity in the face of tremendous threat and hostility and possible erasure. I've read, I believe it was Stalin's plan to have a Lithuania on the map without Lithuanians. But this language was the mechanism through which the people were preserved. So when I read the Lithuanian literary tradition, Lithuanian poets from earlier generations, even Blože or Geda, I encounter something that seems to be an intoxication inside of the language. But I do think in the post-Soviet moment, so the vitality, it was the engine of tradition that animated or gave color to the earlier poets. But after 1990, it seems to me that the new energies of Lithuanian poetry are not always participating in this sense of the pagan imagination, the magically real, these transformative powers that live inside of the world and are only perceived by the immediacy of Lietuviškai. Because I do experience the language of Lietuviškai as one that brings the earth very close to your attention. Things have their own tremendous power. I think for me the symbol of Lietuviškai is Priya. Things live near each other, and you see them in their togetherness. They're not determined by that, but they rise up in their association, their juxtaposition. But I think the newer poets are less participating perhaps in that, and are more extroverted. They're taking literatures from outside and processing them through the Lietuviškai language and engaging in new forms of experiment. I think it's a lot harder to speak now about one poetry in Lithuania today than it would have been if we were having this conversation 20 years ago. I think we could have, talk about personalities of the language in the poets, but now there are almost different languages of poetry inside of Lithuanian, in my thinking. I think a lot about the division that a British poet, UK, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, made between kinds of form. He identified one as mechanical form. This would be something like the sonnet, something like the villanelle. It comes to us and it has its own machinery, and we just learn how to use the machine. It's not to say that it's easy, but this is one way of generating a creative object. The other is organic, some sense that it's exhibiting its own nature in its realization. This would be like the genome becoming a child. This is one form of literature. To me, this division is useful, I think sometimes false, because even when we're using mechanical form, what we look for is the experience of the organic. A sonnet is only meaningful when the form is instrumental to the expression, when these things are the same. Not just, this is a sonnet because I wanted it to be. There's something inauthentic about that. More than that, there's something fraudulent. It is not really a sonnet in the full life and permission space of the sonnet. It's just an impersonation of the sonnet. Do you see what I mean? So what do I dislike when I read contemporary Lithuanian literature is the same as I dislike in reading contemporary English literature. When I see forms of experiment or something that seem to me inorganic, that are being used in order to be used, but not in order to express something authentic. So if I observe in the Lithuanian contemporary literary tradition some borrowing, if I see something that I think could just be an American poem, but it happens to be in Lithuanian, this is not what delights me. I want to see something new, something of a new imagination that seems deeply connected to the Lithuanian language and its potential, an experiment that comes in that seems like a stone or seems, like a tree, something that is growing authentically according to its own program. Well, I think Walt Whitman was only translated in a complete way very recently. So I would say that there's something in the spirit of global literature which often is influenced by the leading hegemonic or imperial powers of the era. And the United States has a huge export value with its poetries. I think that people who are excited about contemporary literature are often aware of major American figures, but I would say there's a limited set, perhaps, of poets here who are really engaged with the U.S. tradition in such a way as they could be influenced by it. I think there are a lot of poets who are aware and remain interested in something adjacent to it, not derived from it. Yeah, I think the vitality here is pronounced. I'm richly impressed that there are several literary festivals per year. In San Diego, my home city in the United States, there are approximately 3 million residents, and we have one book festival per year, and it is not dedicated to poetry. It's not even really literary. It's popular books, But here you have Druskininkai, you have Poezijos Pavasaris. Now Literatų Namai has opened in addition to the Writers' Union. These events, book presentations, functions. You have the Vilnius Book Festival. In a year, there must be 5 or 6 events, something like this, yeah? So every couple of months, there's a new occasion. I think the liveliness of the literary community here is significant and impressive. If I were to offer a criticism, I might say that the one thing that could be done is the exportation of the Lithuanian tradition. Because in some way, although of course now the writing community, the community of poets and writers is more extroverted and they're open to the world of literature, the world of literature is not as open to the Lithuanians. So in some secret way, it remains writing back into Lithuania, but not writing out from Lithuania into the world. Now, I'm not suggesting that anybody write in Angliškai, but the exercise of exportation through translation, publicization, making the world aware of the Lithuanian, the vitality of the Lithuanian literary community, I think is important. I think the example of Ireland is perhaps instructive, though of course I recognize that linguistic shift is important, but when you think about writers like James Joyce, William Butler Yeats, Samuel Beckett. Of course, Beckett was living in France, and Yeats sometimes in London as well. And Joyce left, but they're all, Synge. They're all AE. This is an island of 3.5 million people at that time, smaller than Brooklyn, New York, and still had the power to transform 20th century literature. I think more recently of the example of Slovenia in the United States, a small nation that garnered a lot of momentum and enthusiasm, partly through the charismatic voice of Tomáš Šalamun, but largely because a few Americans stumbled upon this community where poets were treated as people with dignity. This is not so in the United States. You can win the Pulitzer Prize and be completely anonymous. In fact, my wife, who lives with me in the United States part of the year, was lamenting early in her relocation that she would always remain unknown. No one would know her poems in the United States. And I said, welcome to the condition of poetry in the United States. It doesn't matter if you are from the United States or from Albania. Nobody in the United States cares about poetry. So other poets would know you, yes, but you're not going to be recognized as Venclova was in Trake by me only a few weeks ago. We were passing and said, that's Venclova. And my wife said, Tome, ačiū, Thank you for all that you have done. This doesn't happen in the United States, maybe in 1 or 2 cafes in New York City, but we name our shopping malls after our poets. Walt Whitman has a bridge and a place for shopping, like, you know, some kind of gurune. We don't have statues for our poets. We don't have monuments. We are looking for some measure of authenticity, and when these Americans stumbled upon Slovenia and found that there was respect for the work of literature, indeed with monuments, with a writers' union that supported, with people who could make art as a form of vocation, they were deeply excited, and it emerged. So yeah, I think of that as a more recent example in the U.S. But I do think that a small nation can absolutely make a large impact and garner a lot of attention. Of course, it has to be high quality literature. This is up to the small nation. If I maintain any concern for the future of Lithuanian literature, it derives in some way from that extroversion and from a new sense of distance from the crisis and risk that artistic creation always occasions for the person who is doing it deeply and truly and well. And I worry that some of the American consumerism that has influenced a lot of postmodern and further literatures, where part of the project of the poem or the novel is to satirize or ironize the very possibility of doing something with genuineness, and thus to elude or evade the responsibilities of serious production, could enter the realm of Lithuanian literature. In other words, my fear is that by being too aware of global tendencies, a small nation like Lithuania can import those tendencies and then just be a reproduction of an attitude toward literature that is opposite to that long-standing strength that's inside of the powerful and defiant resistance that Lithuanian poetry retained. My hope is that there will never be a sense of the glib, of speaking too easily, of speaking too readily, and of losing touch with that tradition, which is its own source of molten heat underneath this beautiful seething that I see inside of that tradition, the energy and the faithfulness of that tradition. I don't mean in terms of religiosity, but I mean in terms of engagement, the recognition that the manufacture of every work of art is a form of almost religious construction. However ironic, however postmodern, however full of laughter, there must always be some recognition of that deep commitment that undergirds all of those years of resistance inside that early literature. This is my fear for the future of the Lithuanian literary community, is that at some point it will be indistinguishable from every other 21st century literary community.